Good evening, everyone. Thank you for turning up to the last of the individual hustings with the Liberal Democrats' potential parliamentary candidate, Steve Bradley.
Ready?
Same format. It was the format as all the other ones. There will be a 5-minute opening speech, and then there will be 4 pre-prepared questions which we've asked all the candidates, which will have about 5 minutes each, and then we will open it up to the floor for the rest of the session. If you'd like to ask any questions, we've got a couple of roaming mics, or you can go on Twitter on #BathDecides, and I will try and be better than the other hosts and read a few off Twitter. Steve, whenever you're ready, please crack on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Freddie. Good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay with the mic. As Freddie said, my name is Steve Bradley. I'm the Liberal Democrat candidate hoping to keep Bath Liberal in May. It's fantastic to be here this evening. I'm a graduate from Bath Uni myself. I studied what is now BBA. Are there any BBAs in the house? No, that well-known hotbed of political activism? I suspect they're all off, either in the library or busy making their millions. Solidarity, comrade. I also spent 2 very happy years of my life as president of Bath University Student Union here. In my opening remarks, I'm not actually going to talk to you now too much about policy, because I'm sure we'll cover an awful lot of that in about an hour and a half of questions. Instead, I'm going to explain a little bit about why I got into politics, and then a bit about what difference I think the Liberal Democrats make in British politics. I want to start by going back to the 9th of April, 1992. On that day, myself and 3 of my housemates from Conagry 3 walked up to the polling station on the edge of campus and did something from Conagry 3. Fantastic. I'll chat to you later about that. And we did something that not a lot of young people did in those days, and that was we voted in a general election. And I came to Bath straight after school, and I was interested in politics, but I really didn't like party politics. I didn't know much about the Liberal Democrats. Back then, the Conservatives had been in power for 13 years. My housemates and I weren't Lib Dems, but we knew we certainly weren't Conservatives. And Bath had a Conservative MP. So the only party at that time who could beat them in Bath were the Liberal Democrats. We voted for the Lib Dems, and as a result, partly because of our effort, for the first time, this city elected somebody who wasn't a Conservative. After my degree, as I mentioned, I spent 2 years as student union president, during which we ran a really big campaign about buses, and the only local political party who showed any interest in helping us at that time was the Liberal Democrats. So that started to open my mind to the party, and I looked into their policies. And by the time of the 1997 general election, when I was president, I was pretty much a Lib Dem voter. So after uni, I did what my parents said I should have done before, and I went off and got a proper job. I spent 10 years doing marketing for Procter & Gamble, Walt Disney. And then in 2003, something happened which really changed my life, basically. And that was the Iraq War. On a really cold and wet day in February that year, I joined over 1 million people on the streets of London to say that any war in Iraq would not happen in our name. I was inspired that people cared enough to get out in the streets and campaign and complain about an issue. And I was utterly dismayed when a few weeks later, the Labour government went and started that war anyway. And the only party in Parliament who consistently said the Iraq war was wrong and would be a disaster was the Lib Dems. That sealed my decision. I decided to get actively involved in politics to try and ensure we didn't make stupid decisions like that again, and I did it through the Lib Dems. And I soon realised politics is pretty much my calling. I left my rather comfortable job at Walt Disney, studied a master's degree in urban regeneration, set up my own business as a consultant on sustainability. 4 years ago, I came back to Bath, and when Don Foster announced he was going to retire, I was asked to put my name in the hat, and I guess the rest is history. So that's the journey that I took to end up in front of you guys today, and it's a journey which was a combination of my student experience in Bath and an illegal war, which turned me from an ordinary person into a politician at what is the ripe old age in politics of 31. Now, I'm sure we'll get on to lots of questions later. I'd be stunned if there aren't questions on tuition fees, for example. But before we get on to that, I just want to very quickly leave you with one thought. Britain has a coalition government now for the first time in decades. And it looks pretty certain we'll have another one in May. We're used in this country to having just one political party in charge. And if we're honest, we're still getting used to the idea of 2 parties working together, very different parties with different identities and beliefs, but working together in a professional, business-like manner to provide stable government. And with that adjustment to coalitions, some of you may be wondering, well, what really do the Lib Dems do? What are they all about in British politics? So I'm just going to take a few seconds to hopefully explain that to you. As I said, previous governments here have been either majority Conservative or majority Labour. They've lurched really from right to left and back again, and what we saw was the same pattern. When the Conservatives ran the government, they slashed public spending, looked after the rich, and left our society broken. And then when Labour ran the government, they spent more money than the country had, told everybody how to live their lives, and left our economy broken. So my pitch to you, as I wrap up now, is that we don't have to lurch from left to right continuously anymore in this country. We don't have to go from broken economy to broken society, because there is a middle way. Despite being in government for the worst recession in 80 years, and despite taking some decisions I can assure you no Liberal got into politics to take, we have anchored this government in the centre ground. We've helped get the economy back on track, and yes, we have helped build a fairer society in Britain. We've completely neutered the right wing of the Conservatives. We've blocked a long list of negative Tory policies, which I'm happy to explain. And we've delivered 80% of our own manifesto, despite having only 9% of MPs. So that's my pitch to you this evening. The Lib Dems anchor this country's government in the centre ground, more economically competent than Labour, more socially compassionate than the Conservatives, delivering a fairer society with a stronger economy, anchoring Britain in the centre ground where I believe it absolutely belongs. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for your opening speech. Now we'll go on to the pre-prepared questions. In Bath, necessities like housing and transport are becoming less and less affordable, with no alternatives available for students. How will you address this problem?
Let me make a quick note. Housing and transport. Okay, very quickly, the easiest answer on housing is to build more. There is no problem in our housing situation which won't be helped by building more housing. At the moment in this country, we need to build about 240,000 units a year just to keep up with our growth in population. And it's not, don't let UKIP tell you, it's because of immigration. It's not. It's because people are living longer. They're living on their own in single-family households for longer. Relationships are breaking up, so people are living, again, independent lives. There's lots of reasons why, but we need to build more housing. We need about 245,000 a year. We currently build about half of that. So firstly, the Liberal Democrats want to build 300,000 new homes a year. We've outlined exactly how we'll do that, and a key part is opening up the huge swathes of publicly owned land, which is sitting there idle. Even in this city, for 20 years, we had Ministry of Defence land, which was sitting idle. And I'm really proud it's the current Liberal Democrat-run council that has got those bits of land, so they all have planning permission now, and they're all being built on. That's one example. So nationally, 300,000 homes. Locally, we are delivering 7,500 new homes on brownfield sites in Bath. We also need to make sure we're building the right types of homes, the right units which suit the makeup of families and individuals. We also need to make sure we're building greener homes. I'm really proud we've got a policy which in one of our green laws, we want to introduce 5 green laws in the first 2 years of any involvement in government again. One of them is to ensure, as part of a Sustainable Transport Act, that any new building, any new planning applications have to show how people can get there without necessarily having to use a car. And we also want to build the right types of housing. So, for example, in Bath, we insist that at least 30% of all new housing must be social. It's criminal what's happened since the right to buy was brought in by the Conservatives in the very early 1980s. This country has lost net 1.5 million social housing units. A lot of those have gone straight into the private rented sector owned by landlords. 1 million went under the Conservatives, but Labour were no better. In 13 years, 500,000 net social housing units disappeared in this country. This government is the first one since before Right to Buy came in that has delivered a net increase in social housing. And as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of work on that in Bath through our rule for 30%. So firstly, we need to build more housing, the right type, in the right places. Secondly, we need to ensure rental standards are higher. Students, 99.9% of them will rent. We've done a lot of work on that locally through HMO licensing, ensuring that landlords have to up their game in terms of fire safety regulations, waste management, gardens, things like that. Nationally, we are bringing in a policy that energy performance certificates will have an impact, so you won't be able to rent out a property that is poor performing on energy. You shouldn't. Why should somebody pick up the electricity bill for the fact that you just won't insulate your property? We're stopping that. And finally, on housing, we also want to ensure that when you guys get round to wanting to buy a home, that you're able to do so. In Bath, we have one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. We want to ensure you can get the deposit together, which is often the hardest bit of buying a home. So we have a policy called rent to own. And we're basically working through certain landlords, certain social landlords, and it's been tested in London very successfully. You will rent a property out. Your rent will not be any higher than the average rents in the area, but a portion of your rent every month will go towards you owning that property. If you stay there for 30 years, you will own it outright. If you leave at any point, you will own a share of it, which you can then cash in or potentially take with you. So we're going to make it easier for people to buy when the time comes. So that's housing. On transport, I've had huge experience on this in Bath. I mentioned earlier on, when I was student union president, we ran what was great fun, a 2-year boycott of First Bus. We brought a small company in, and to cut a long story short, Bath University has the cheapest buses in Bath. It has the only night bus service in Bath. It is the best bus service in Bath, and that is entirely, I kid you not, because of that campaign that I helped run 20 years ago. And I also personally designed a number of the bus routes, the U18 which goes through Oval Park. I designed that personally with a highlighter pen and an A to Z map of Bath. So we've shown that students themselves can help the bus companies come up with commercially viable routes. It's ridiculous that a student designed what was a commercially viable route that 20 years later still works. So in terms of what we're doing at a local level, I'm really pleased the Liberal Democrat Council has adopted the first transport strategy the City of Bath has had for 50 years. Transport's been the biggest problem in Bath for decades. Nobody had a strategy for it. We do now. And there's some important elements in that which we're seeking government funding for. And because we've got a strategy, we can now go out and get government funding. We're also doing a lot of stuff on buses, working with First Bus. Personally, I would like to see the legislation change to give councils more power over buses. I think it was a very bad deregulation when the Conservatives did it in 1984. But we're working with the company within the current legislation to ensure they provide a better and fairer and cheaper service. And on cycling, we want to bring in segregated cycle routes around Bath, but we have to do some work around reclaiming road space to do that. And finally, on transport, at a national level, the Liberal Democrats have a policy where you have your young person's rail card. We want to bring in a bus version. It will be a young person's bus discount card for anybody up to the age of 21 who's either in employment or full-time education will qualify, and it will give you 2/3 discount on bus services anywhere in the country. That's something that we will bring in. And as I mentioned, I'd like to see greater regulation of buses overall so we can impact the prices and the reliability. So hopefully that gives you an idea for what the Liberal Democrats locally and nationally would do to address problems around housing, both now and in the future when you look to buy one, and some of the issues in Bath around transport.
Brilliant. Are there any quick questions on housing and transport, or should we move on to the next question? Brilliant.
Does that mean I've bored them all? Or?
So the next question is, students are always keen to boost their CV with work experience and to get the most from their degrees. How will you ensure graduates enter the job market prepared?
When I left Bath University after being president, I went to work for Procter & Gamble, who were based in Newcastle at the time. And I ran their recruitment from Bath University. Bath was one of the 12 universities they targeted, so I ran that for 3 years. Fantastic, I got to come down a lot, but also gave me a real insight into what big companies look for when they recruit students, what's important to them. A few things I would say. Firstly, we absolutely have to ensure that the degrees people are getting in this country are good. And that's never been more important because you are now competing not just with other young people around this country, but you're competing with other young people internationally, other people from within Europe, other people from around the world. So if British degrees aren't held in high esteem, it doesn't really matter how hard you work here, your degree won't be worth as much. So we have to keep British universities high in the league tables, and it's fantastic to see Bath University pushing itself up the rankings and starting to knock on the door of the top 100s. Secondly, one thing I was really keen to do when I was president here was extracurricular activities. Do we still have sorted or sorts?
It's skills training now.
Skills training, right. Well, it was called Sorted in my time. That was a program of providing skills training for the students here. Again, stuff that they could put in their CV. And that was an idea that I saw some other student unions do really well. That sort of thing is really important, being able to show that you're a rounded individual, not just somebody who spends a lot of time in the library or in lectures. There's other things like student community action, which I think is now called student volunteering. And just showing that you've done more than just sit in a lecture theatre is absolutely vital. Thirdly, we need to do more, I believe, to provide good employment opportunities for students whilst you're students, because that both helps boost your CV and helps give you an income. There's lots to be done in Bath on that. We're creating a whole new quarter in Bath, a business district called Innovation Quay. It will have 400,000 square foot of office space. It will provide 9,000 jobs. It will be a landmark destination for the creative, digital and technology community in the city, because that's something the Liberal Democrats Council is pushing, to have Bath be a global national leader on. So there'll be huge potential job opportunities for young, motivated, intelligent students like yourselves in that. And at the moment, Bath has 1.8% unemployment. So for the economists out there, almost full employment. So we need young people like yourselves who want to get involved in the local jobs market to do so, because we have a real talent shortage. Finally, we need to ensure that when you do leave university, there are opportunities for you. And again, that's nationally, making sure our economy stays on track and we continue to pay down the deficit so we can have a growing economy in future. You've probably heard the stats. There are now more jobs have been created than ever before. There are more women in employment than ever before, et cetera, et cetera. We need to keep making sure we're providing opportunities for people like you when you graduate. And also locally, the Liberal Democrat Council has done a lot of work on how we retain students in Bath. We have about 4,000 graduates from this university alone every year. And you guys have been really well skilled up in a fantastic university. You're bright, you're dynamic, you're fleet of foot. Most of you leave Bath, and it's a brain drain in the city. And we're looking at what we can do to stop that. So we had a big conference about 2 years ago, starting the process of what can we do to retain more graduates in this city. And that's something I'm really passionate about. And I hope that new area I mentioned, Innovation Quay, will provide all sorts of new opportunities for people like you. So if you do want to stay in Bath, there are opportunities for you. If you want to go elsewhere, we need to make sure there are opportunities outside the city. And then the very last point I would make, Freddie, is it's an aside really, but do you know, I don't believe that university is just about preparing you for the jobs market. I believe passionately that the pursuit of knowledge is an honourable end in itself. I think just wanting to learn something in itself for its own sake is good. And I think what's really helpful is to ensure that our students are rounded people who aren't just, you know, machine fodder for the global jobs market. So the final thought I would leave is, yes, absolutely, we need to make sure that your time in university is well spent and there are huge opportunities for you whilst you're here and when you leave. But don't lose sight of the fact that being a student is about much more than just focusing on having a job at the end of it all.
Brilliant. Are there any questions on this question? Okay, good, we'll move on. The next question is, young people make up a huge proportion of voters in this constituency, yet turnout remains low and students feel disaffected with politicians. How will you re-engage with young people in politics?
Very good question. I mean, firstly, I would say we have issues with engagement across all age groups. Turnout, if you look at it in the longer term, has slowly been going down in this country. It has little peaks every so often, but the trajectory is pretty much down. There's a number of reasons why that is. Part of it, if I'm honest with you, I mean, I'm from Northern Ireland. I grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Back in those days, everybody voted because, to be honest, it meant a hell of a lot. Part of the downside of democracy is it's fundamentally really rather boring. A lot of the big issues, if you go back to the 60s and 70s and the 50s, the Iron Curtain, you know, nuclear weapons, all that sort of thing, a lot of those sort of things, obviously not nuclear weapons, but a lot of those sort of things have kind of been resolved. So the big dividing points that people could get really excited about in politics are no longer there. And in some ways, that's a shame. But one of the downsides of democracy and having a normal, peaceful, stable society is, you know, politics becomes more about who's managing the economy rather than grand philosophical ideas of left versus right and capitalism versus socialism, communism, and everything else. But we clearly have a problem at the moment with apathy across various generations. We've had apathy of young people all the way along, and I'll read you something in a second to sort of explain that. But there really is an acute problem right now, so absolutely I agree you're right to raise that. Firstly, it's clear to me when I speak to people at schools, Bath College, either the universities, that young people are genuinely interested in issues which I would call political. You may not view them as political. It could be environmental issues. It could be, as we saw in Scotland, the Scottish referendum Huge interest amongst young people. So I do believe that young people are engaged in issues. It's just that very often they don't bundle that up with party politics. But the biggest problem I think we have, and I hope the biggest solution, I think our political system is utterly broken. And it's something the Lib Dems have been saying for quite some time. Our voting system is archaic and out of date. The processes within our parliament are archaic and out of date. We saw yesterday the usual weekly yaboo between the leader of the Labour Party and the leader of the Conservatives. And it's probably great for foreigners to watch this. Oh, very exciting. But it's utterly pointless. Public school childish nonsense, if I'm quite honest with you. We still have a political system which is dominated by very big money, by very large companies. 25% of all money, if it goes into the Conservative Party, comes from hedge funds. What are those people getting in return for their money? On the other side of the coin, you have the Labour Party getting huge donations from trade unions. The Liberal Democrats, we don't get money from big businesses. We don't get money from trade unions. We get money from individuals. I heard that you had the Green Party candidate in a couple of weeks ago who claimed that the Green Party doesn't take big donations. Well, I'm sorry to dispel that myth, they do. They took £300,000 from Vivienne Westwood, who is now under investigation within the Green Party for being a tax dodger. So she had to pull out of a tour of student unions around the country. So, to be honest, no party is immune from this because we have an arms race for money within British politics. And unless, in the view of the Liberal Democrats, you have a cap on political donations, this will not stop. So we want political donations capped at £10,000, which means you can't have Vivienne Westwood giving £300,000. You can't have trade unions giving £1 million in 1 year. Nobody can give, or no organisation can give more than £10,000. We think that's really important. We obviously want fairer votes. We tried in this government. Unfortunately, pretty much no other party agreed with us on that. But I'm convinced this election will show our voting system is completely and utterly broken. You will have parties who get about 15, 10% of the votes who will have pretty much no MPs. We got 23% of the vote in 2010. We ended up with 9% of the MPs. That's something seriously wrong there. And also we want power to be devolved much closer to people. If you can really see the impact of you engaging in politics, going to meetings, having a vote, can have in what happens in your area, I genuinely believe you're much more likely to have a say. So I really believe, and the Liberal Democrats believe, our system is broken. We need wholesale constitutional reform. We need to get rid of a lot of the archaic stuff, the idea that you bung the House of Lords full of donors and people who are just born wealthy, or even bishops. Why are bishops in there rather than imams and rabbis? Who knows? And that we should devolve power, take big money out of politics. And finally, I mentioned earlier on, if I have the time, Freddie, I mentioned that young people have been apathetic about politics for a while. This is the worst prop ever, probably. I genuinely have this framed in the wall in my office. This is quite cheesy. This is Sponge magazine, which, when I was student union president, was the internal mouthpiece of the student union, really. And this is from 28th of April, 97, so just the week of the election that year. And I wrote this cover, and it has a quote from Plato at the top, and it says, "The punishment of those who refuse to take part in the political system is to live under the government of more foolish people." And then it goes on, which I won't read about, but it's this mildly cheesy thing where I was saying, basically, companies are about market share, bands want record sales, football teams deal in points. For politicians, the currency is votes. And it says, students are being ignored. Ever wonder why? The blame for this lies not with politicians, because they're just playing the age-old game of devising policies in terms of what will and won't win them the votes. So the blame lies with students, this is my view when I was a student, I'm not saying now, who by generally failing to vote in the past have given politicians no incentive to listen to them. So basically, if you won't vote, they won't listen, have your say, make them listen in 97. Now that was 20 years ago when I wrote the cover story of the magazine in this university telling students to get out and vote. So we've had apathy 20 years before that. We'll have apathy probably in 20 years' time. But I do think we have a bit of an acute problem, and I hope I've outlined some ways in which I think we can try and do something about that, because it really, really does matter. We hear a lot on TV about older people getting what they want, and that is kind of true. There's so many hands in the air in politics. There's so many voices clamoring and shouting for things. We get so many emails about different issues in our in-tray that it really often is the case of who shouts the loudest gets what they want. And at the moment, young people and students' voices are being completely overwhelmed by other voices. So whether you vote for me or not, ideally I hope you will, but please at least do use your vote.
Brilliant. Are there any follow-up questions on this? Just wait for the roaming mic to come up to you.
I've got my own roving mic. A little dancing. Can you still hear me?
Hi. So the AV referendum didn't work. So what's kind of the plan for this fantastic political reform?
I like your thinking. What was your name, sorry?
Jessica.
Jessica, thank you, Jessica. Really good question. AV, yeah, I mean, AV was, I think Nick Clegg himself described it as a horrible little compromise, because it was. I mean, AV is not a great system, but it's better than the system we've got. It means that for the first time, you don't have to look at doing entirely tactical votes. I mentioned in April 1992, that 3 of my housemates and I went to vote. We weren't Lib Dems, but we knew what we were. But we also knew we weren't Conservatives, so we voted to get rid of the Conservatives here. Had we had a different voting system, we could have achieved the same objective, possibly in a different way. But at that time in Bath, and it's pretty much the same now, the only way to get rid of the Conservatives then was to vote Lib Dem, and the only way to stop the Conservatives in Bath now is still to vote Lib Dem. That's not a fair system. It doesn't let people vote for what they really want. It means some people kind of have to vote for who they least dislike. So it's really important we change that. We tried in the AV referendum. I think it was the timing was wrong. The campaign was awful in favour of AV, if I'm quite honest with you. It was easily put aside, but these really emotional posters of children in hospitals and our soldiers in Iraq sort of thing saying there'll be less money for them if we have this voting system. Utterly nonsense stuff, but very emotional. And I think the big lesson was, without one of the major parties supporting a change in the political voting system, you probably won't get it. Labour, about half the Labour Party is starting to realise we do need a different voting system, but they saw that as an opportunity to give the coalition a bloody nose, and they played politics when they should really have backed voting reform. Very interesting to hear now that UKIP, who thought tooth and nail against AV, now think it's a rather good thing, partly because they could have 15% of the vote and end up with 1 or 2 MPs. So it shows you how broken that is. In terms of where we go from here, I think, I don't know the strategy that the Lib Dems would look to follow, and I wouldn't reveal it if I did, but what I suspect would probably look to do, if we were in a coalition again, we would push again for fairer voting, but we'd probably start with local elections. The only elections in the moment in this country which aren't done on proportional representation are Westminster UK-wide and local elections in England. Every other election, Scottish Assembly, Welsh Assembly, London Assembly, Northern Irish Assembly, all done on proportional representation. The local elections in Scotland, done on proportional representation, because the Lib Dems pushed that through when we were in a coalition there in the first Scottish government. So I think we would do the incrementalist approach, and we'd probably get local elections on PR through without a referendum, and that leaves just one glaring election where you don't have fairer voting, and I think the pressure then will just be too immense. But the forces against changing the voting system are huge. It's the self-interest of the 2 main parties. But I hope the voice of people after this election, when the results will just be completely out of kilter with how people voted, I hope that will start to become overwhelming. Does that answer your question, Jessica? Thank you.
Brilliant. The final question, and you've touched on this slightly earlier, which is, employment remains a primary concern for students. How will your party create competitive employment opportunities in Bath and across the UK?
Yeah, I guess I kind of touched on this. We're very clear within the Lib Dems, both locally and nationally, on what we would do to create more employment. So nationally, we think there's real opportunities for Britain to be global leaders in certain sectors. And we've identified a number of ones. And within that, green jobs is something that I'm really proud that we're helping to push heavily as a party. We think there's big opportunities in electric vehicles, in storage, energy storage, so battery technology, in carbon capture and storage, and I've forgotten the 4th one. It'll come to me in a second. But there are 4 sectors where offshore wind, where we think we're in a really good position. We have fantastic universities in this country doing fantastic research, including the one we're all in today. So we want to leverage the things this country is really good at and ensure we become a global leader, because that will create huge opportunities and huge wealth down the line. So we're picking the winners. The Lib Dems want to pick where we think the world is going in terms of economic opportunities and ensure this country is at the head of the game in those. So that's what we're doing nationally. And locally in Bath, we run the council, we have done for 3.5 years. We're doing pretty much the same thing. Bath, at the moment, along with Bristol, is the most significant cluster of high technology, digital and creative jobs outside of London. A lot of this is really small scale stuff, 1, 2, 3-man bands, working in sheds, bedrooms, shared spaces. But there's a huge opportunity for Bath to be an even bigger player. So we are very clear in our economic strategy that we want Bath to be the national hub for digital, creative, and IT jobs, because that is clearly a growth area in the future. To put it very briefly into numbers, and apologies if this is a bit boring, Bath, in terms of employment numbers, relies on tourism and retail. Tourism and retail is notoriously low paid. The average value added per job, so the amount that the economy gets per job, in tourism is about £21,000 a year, and in retail it's about £24,000 a year. So that's what each job and that is creating for the economy. If you then go to the creative, digital, and IT sector, there are far less jobs, but they actually create the same amount of money for this economy. So in terms of gross value added, every one person working in those sectors is creating £72,000 for this economy. So 3 times the benefit, despite having way less than half the employees, which shows you that we can keep Bath as a place which is all about shopping and tourism, and that's kind of helpful in some ways, but they're low-level jobs. There are people who are cleaning tables and turning beds and working in bars and restaurants, and some of that work was brilliant for people like yourselves who want flexible jobs, but we need to think about better paid jobs and more of them in the city, and we've got a very clear plan moving forwards for how we do that. Hopefully, was there anything else in the question that I didn't answer, Freddie?
Across the UK as well.
Yeah, we talked about picking and choosing winning segments and making sure we keep Britain's economy in a good place. But fundamentally, the absolute key to ensuring there are more jobs in this country is getting our economy entirely back on track. We had a financial heart attack in 2008. 6% of our economy was erased, a huge sum of money, lots of jobs disappeared in a very short period of time. It wasn't just because of the banks, although the banks did play a part. We need to be very honest. We had a government which pretty much every single year it was in existence spent money it didn't have. Labour were in power for 13 years. 11 of those years, they spent more money than they had coming in tax. And you just simply cannot do that. So when the economy popped, the music stopped, we found that we had a huge amount of debt that as a nation we could no longer service. And in fact, we had what's called structural debt. So we had set our country up to permanently be generating debt every year because we were built to spend more than we were bringing in. And that's what we're now trying to unpick at the moment. And whoever wins the next election, doesn't matter what combination of parties it is, doesn't matter if it involves Labour or anybody else, they are going to have to keep unpicking that structural deficit to get us to a stage where we're not paying more money every year than we're bringing in. We hope to complete that job by 2018. We plan to do it fairly. And then after 2018, when the economy is hopefully in balance and the deficit is cleared, we then want to invest the money that this country generates in infrastructure and then public services. And there's a real difference between the 3 main parties, and I'll very briefly outline this if I can, Freddie. So we want by 2018, very briefly, we want by 2018 to have cleared the deficit, focus then on having a surplus, but using the surplus to invest in infrastructure and public services. The Conservatives also want to clear the deficit by 2018, but once that's done, they want to they want to do that by cutting public services entirely. We want to clear the deficit by cutting public services, but spending on public services, but also by ensuring that the wealthiest in society pay more. So I can give some examples later if we've got time on what we're doing on the banks, for example, to ensure they pay more. The Conservatives just want public services to fund the money that needs to come out to balance the books. Then they want to keep cutting public services and use the surplus they generate to give tax breaks to mostly middle class and wealthy people. It's what Margaret Thatcher did in the 80s, and it kept getting her re-elected. That is their strategy. They will take £38 billion worth of spending out of our economy, out of our public services. That's the equivalent of every penny we spend on all our schools. It's the equivalent of 4 times what we spend on our police. There's no way they can deliver what they say they want to do without decimating public services. And we certainly don't support that. And then finally, Labour want to clear the deficit, but to take longer doing it. And what that means is we will spend more money on interest payments, and austerity will last longer. They'll spend an extra £4 billion on interest payments. So those are the options. Labour will take a bit longer and spend more money and be a bit more pain doing it. Conservatives will get rid of the deficit, but absolutely fire sale public services to do it and give the money out in tax breaks. We will be in the middle, where we'll have a combination of making sure the wealthiest pay more to balance the books, some impact on public services, but then once we balance the books, we'll then reinvest in the public services after that. And one of those options will have to happen to make sure we can provide the economic growth and the job opportunities moving forwards for this country.
Thank you. We'll now move on to giving questions to the floor. So in the interest of time, can we keep questions and answers as concise as possible so we can cover as many topics as we can? Let's start with the gentleman in the other top, and then let's go down.
Are you really at Harvard?
No, I just went there. Sorry, it's going to be, I've got a big point I want to raise, and so it's going to be a reasonably long question. On the 7th of February, I received, on the 7th of February, I received, like many people in this room, received an unsolicited email from you. I was strongly considering voting Liberal Democrat. I agree with your policies on the EU, and I think you've done a positive role in the coalition constraining the Tories. But I feel this gross invasion of my privacy, and this thoroughly illiberal action, considering you call yourself the Liberal Democrats, was unjustified. So I took the time to write to you, Don Foster, Bath Liberal Democrats, never received a response. So my question to you is, can you please explain this action? And unless I receive an apology, I'm afraid you've lost my vote.
Okay. Okay, no, it's a good question. Firstly, I'm happy to verbally apologise now. Both for you not getting an answer. I mean, I didn't receive your communication. It probably just got lost in the office, but that's no excuse. So we need to get back to you on that. I'll get your details at the end and make sure I do in writing. But I will apologise to yourself and to anybody else for the fact that there was an unsolicited email that was sent around the students at the university. Just to explain what happened. What we did, anybody in this room, anybody outside this room could do. It's very, very easy to get the list, to get the details of email addresses of students freely available on the university internet. The university know that, and I think they were a little bit embarrassed when it happened. We know it because we have a really hard-working team of students who help us out, and they're really passionate to see that Bath stays liberal, that we keep the city in liberal hands rather than go back to the Conservatives, and they saw an opportunity to communicate to students and make sure students could hear our message. Because it's really difficult, especially for students on campus, for political parties to communicate with you. So we didn't do anything wrong. The university admitted we didn't do anything wrong. There is a wide open door on the university's portal to get these email addresses. We haven't told anybody else how it was done because it's up to the university to decide whether they want to close that door. But regardless, I mean, it was clumsy. I'll be completely honest with you, I will make no excuses for that. I do apologise for it. It was done with sort of good intention and a bit of zeal to get across to you rather than any desire to do anything wrong. And as I said, it wasn't anything wrong. And finally, it's entirely up to yourself how you decide to vote, but the future of this country is really in question in this election. It really is what direction we take in terms of public services and spending and everything else. So please, I would sort of beseech you to sort of see through this one issue, which I am genuinely apologetic for, and focus on the bigger picture, which is about making sure we get the country back in a strong economy state, but also making sure we have a fair society when we do that at the same time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. And we can go to you, sir.
Hiya. Students are probably one of the biggest consumers of alcohol. So I was wondering, how would you vote on legislation
I'm Irish, I can say that's right.
on minimum pricing for alcohol?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know what the party position in this is, so I'm not going to try and pretend to do. But I will find out for you. At the end, come and see me and I'll tell you. I can give you what I guess is probably our idea. I mean, Liberals, we don't like...
What would you vote?
What would I do?
Yeah, what party would you vote?
I think there's an argument for minimum pricing, but I wouldn't set the bar too high. I think the fact that you can buy some pretty nasty paint stripping, flagons of cider for less than you can buy, bottles of Coke and stuff like that, is not ideal, if I'm quite honest with you. It's part of a bigger thing. I mean, we have a strange culture in this society that I am absolutely as guilty about as anybody else, and that we've got a pretty, I'll be honest, I mean, we have a pretty immature approach to alcohol, which a lot of other countries don't have. It's a Northern European thing, hence, I'm Irish, so I'm certainly not grown up when it comes to alcohol either, and Scandinavians and Germans can have the same approach, but we've never really as a country got into the idea where, you just take a small bit of alcohol, we don't let our kids have, a glass of wine over their lunch because we kind of say, well, you're not allowed to drink till you're 18. You go to the continent, kids 14, 15 are having one glass of wine with a meal. It's not killing them. Instead, we say you can't really drink until you're 18, and then we all kind of turn into binge drinkers for a period and get that off our chest, really. I guess some of us don't. So firstly, I think we need a more grown-up approach to alcohol, and I would also say we need a more grown-up approach to drugs and pretty much every other form of vice we have in this country, but we may get the chance to discuss that later. But in terms of minimum pricing, I think there is a real problem that it's crazy that alcohol, it can be so cheap, and also how it's marketed. I remember when Alco Pops were coming in, and they were clearly, this is going back about 15 years, 20 years ago, they were clearly aimed at kids. I mean, there's no dispute about the way the bottle was labeled, the colors, everything else, and that was a bad idea as well. So, per se, I would be in favor of making sure there is some sort of floor on the price of alcohol, but I wouldn't set it too high because I wouldn't want people like yourselves who want to enjoy a drink, even if you want to get a bit drunk, I don't care, that's your decision. Young people do that, and it's part of just being young. So I wouldn't want it to be prohibitive so that, that enjoyment of life is gone, but I do think it needs to be considered in the context of a wider discussion on our attitude to alcohol. Does that make sense? Yeah. And I'm happy to get the parties line for you, but I'm not going to pretend I know because I don't. So.
Brilliant. Also, if you'd like to put some questions through Twitter, you can use hashtag #BathForSides. So Lisa, and then
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much for coming tonight. So earlier you said that really Bath, although previously you've said don't vote tactically in politics, you've said that Bath's really got the choice between Tories and Lib Dems, but Don Foster has voted consistently on the party line with the Lib Dem Conservative coalition. Do we really have a choice?
Good question. First, I didn't say don't vote tactically. I said that we've got an archaic system which encourages people to vote tactically and encourages people to vote in a way they wouldn't necessarily otherwise do.
On Monday, you did say don't vote tactically.
I'm not familiar with saying it. Where was that?
At
the Green Hustings?
Yes.
No, I think it was videoed. I certainly did not say don't vote tactically because you'll notice then everybody in the room who was in a political party all started to grumble. Basically, every political party in Bath will tell you that they will win. Only one of those political parties is right, that they will win. And I genuinely believe that there's only one other party who's right to say that they can win. Bath has only ever elected either a Conservative or a Liberal Democrat MP, and that's a fact. Not just that, the city has not elected even a councillor. And bear in mind, you only need about 1,200 votes in some places to become a councillor in a city. It has never elected a councillor who wasn't a Lib Dem or a Conservative in over 20 years. So the facts are clear. This is a city which is very polarised between Liberal Democrats and Conservatives. It is the classic two-horse race. You can go back and look at the results in the last election. I genuinely think that won't change, but don't take my word for it. There isn't a single political pundit who has Bath down as a seat that either the Lib Dems or the Conservatives won't win. Look at the bookies. I'm not a gambling man, but bookies are helpful because first, it's an independent view, and secondly, it's a group of people who have their own money on the line, so you would assume they'd get it right. They have the Lib Dems as favourite, odds-on favourite. I wish they didn't, actually, but they do. They have the Conservatives a close second. I think we're at, I think, 4-1 on. The Conservatives are second at 3-1 against. Apologies, anybody doesn't get bookies odds. And then you have this massive leap where UKIP and the Green Party are 50-1. And then a bigger leap again to Labour, who are at 100-1. So an independent organisation that has its own money on the line is telling you what the Liberal Democrats are telling you, which is basically that you will get either a Liberal Democrat MP and a Liberal Democrat council, or a Conservative MP and a Conservative council, because that is the demographics of Bath, and most importantly, that is our voting system. So is there a choice? It's kind of the proverbial Hobson's choice, if you know what that means. It's a choice, but it's not a great choice. But for as long as we have this ridiculous voting system, combined with the demographics of the city of Bath, to honestly, that will remain the choice. It was the choice on 9th of April 1992, when myself and the rest of Conaghy 3 wandered down to vote. 20 odd years later, it's still the choice. I can't see that changing until we get a new voting system, to be quite honest with you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi there. Just going off comments that you mentioned earlier, that I assume you're against our country having nuclear weapons still, and that you were against the Iraq War and all that. What do you and what is the party's opinion on the role of our armed forces? And do you and the party think that our armed forces should be decreased at all in the future?
My personal view, I'm absolutely against the renewal of Trident. I think it's a waste of money. I think it's a weapon system that we know we won't use. Even if we wanted to use it, who would we fire it against? It's really not clear. And I think especially at the current environment, because in a year's time, a decision will be made about whether to commit this country to spending £100 billion on a weapon system we know in our hearts we're not going to use. Given where we are in terms of being still in the middle of austerity, needing to clear a deficit, structural deficit, everything else, I think that is just the wrong decision to make. And if I'm honest with you, I just have a problem with nuclear weapons, full stop. I can't believe anybody in their right mind would push the button and use one. I certainly wouldn't, frankly. So I absolutely don't agree we should renew that. Yes, I was against the Iraq War passionately at the time. It's why I got into politics. The Lib Dems were against the Iraq War. We were against the war in Afghanistan. And we've been proven right. I am convinced there's a straight line between the utter chaos we have in the Middle East now, and the fact that we kicked in the front door in Iraq, went in, messed their country up, albeit with good intentions to remove a dictator, and then we left. We swanned out with no plan for what would happen to this country afterwards, and the whole thing is basically just collapsed. I mean, we just don't see Iraq in the news anymore, but there are still people who, 12 years after the war started, have never had electricity or running water in Baghdad, in the capital city. It's absolutely criminal what a mess we left that country in. So the Lib Dem approach is generally against. Labour started, I think it was, got involved in 14 conflicts in 13 years. One or two of those I would agree with, like Kosovo, where we were there kind of doing peacekeeping, but they seem to just be addicted to going around and enforcing our view of democracy upon the world. And I am very uncomfortable with that. I don't think it's our job to be the world's policeman, and I certainly don't think that we know what democracy is or how it should look, and that we have the right to go and tell anybody else what it should look like either. So that's pretty much my view. It's pretty much the Lib Dem view. What will happen in the future? I mean, we don't know. Nobody really saw the Ukraine problem arising a year ago, but instinctively, the Lib Dems don't believe that the response to a situation like this is military. Military doesn't solve an issue. You need some form of peacekeeping, some form of citizenship, some form of nation building after military conflict. Would have been a lot more better half the time to do it in advance. So in Iraq, I think a combination of sanctions and help for alternative democratic groups in Iraq could have got rid of Saddam Hussein without having to kill 100,000 Iraqis and absolutely destroy their country. Does that answer the question?
Well, going off what you just said, do you think that our armed forces should then be decreased? Seeing as you say that Trident is a waste of money.
Yeah. If you bundle up Trident and the armed forces, then I would say absolutely. But the armed forces will have to bear a share of the reduction in public spending because, again, we have the structural deficit that we need to unpick. I wouldn't want to see a completely emasculated armed forces where it becomes pointless having it. I really wouldn't want to see that. But I think as a nation, 100 years ago, we were the biggest kid in the playground. We had the biggest city in the world in London. We had the biggest empire, the biggest navy and everything else. Those days are long gone. And I think Britain psychologically kind of has to adjust to the fact that we have a new role in the world. And I don't think we need to aim to be one of the biggest military powers in the world because I think we actually as a country have better ways. And I'm a big fan of soft power. We have the English language. We have globally significant culture, literature, music, art, things like that, which really do get you influence around the world. And I think we should use a lot more of that. We've got education. we have people from all over the world coming here to study at universities like this, who then go back to wherever they're from, maintain links with this country, and have a really positive view of Britain. And it's things like that which will make this country great in the future, I believe, not how many boots we can put into a country at the drop of a hat. So hopefully that gives you a bit more of a flavour. Cheers, thank you.
Just going to take a quick question from Twitter, which is, with democracy in your party name, don't you believe people under 58 deserve a referendum on such an important issue as the EU?
I'll give you my personal view. My personal view is I think it would be difficult to not have a referendum. I am a Democrat. I hope that if we did have a referendum on Europe, that the majority of the nation, on reflection of the arguments, would vote to stay in Europe. Just out of curiosity, is anybody here who, and please don't be afraid to put your hand up, is anybody here who thinks we should leave Europe? Hands down, just leave. Okay. I did a debate up on campus in October, I think it was, against Jacob Rees-Mogg, if you know who he is. Funny character. But I mean that in the nicest way, obviously. We're slightly different. And it was 80-20, the vote in terms of who would stay in Europe versus who would leave. What's really interesting, firstly, I really do believe that the argument to stay in Europe is extremely strong on 3 counts. Firstly, on jobs. Being in Europe means Britain is in work. There are 4 million jobs in this country which are directly related to our involvement in Europe. There are a whole host of companies who said they would either leave this country, their operations, if we left Europe, or they would scale them down. A good example is Honda, just up the road in Swindon. Honda uses the UK to build vehicles for the whole of Europe. Motor cars have import duties between trading markets. So if we left the EU, Honda would obviously scale down their production to just make enough in the UK to meet the needs of the UK market. And all that other production, where they currently make vehicles for everybody else, they would move elsewhere. Why? If only to avoid the import tariffs that come with cars. And that's absolute common sense. So that will definitely happen. And there's other things. 15% of all research at UK universities, that funding comes from the EU. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a higher percentage at the University of Bath. So without going into too many things, it's good for jobs that we stay in Europe. 2 other things it's also very good for. Crime. Crime does not respect national boundaries. You may have seen, I can't remember the name of the film, Sexy Beast. You may have seen a few films about the Costa del crime in the 70s and times like that when British gangsters used to leg it off to Spain, living a life of luxury outside of the reach of the law. Those days are long gone. Through tools like Europol and the International European Arrest Warrant, which the Conservatives want to scrap, as do UKIP, we can go after people who have done wrong in this country, bring them back here to face justice, and ensure that they do time. And if you remember the July 7th bombings in London, one of the people involved in that, whose bomb didn't detonate, was a young man who fled to Italy within a very short period of time between collaboration of the Italian and the English police. He was brought back here, he was tried, and he's currently serving 40 years in prison. That would not have happened without us being in the European Union. Crime does not respect borders. And also, it enables us to protect British citizens when we're abroad as well, the fact that European law is standardised. And one final area where it's in our interest to stay in Britain is on the environment. Again, climate change, pollution, carbon doesn't respect national boundaries. You cannot solve a massive issue like climate change, assuming you believe in it, unless you collaborate between nations. So there's lots of good reasons why we should stay in Europe. Personally, I think it's going to be difficult to not have a referendum. I hope that when we finally have all the points for and against laid out equally, because bear in mind, for 30 years, everybody in this country has been drip-fed ridiculously negative horror stories about Europe. All about they want to change the shape of our bananas, and there's 10 billion people coming from Romania who are all going to invade here, and da-da-da-da. I don't see any positive stories about Europe coming out of our media. I don't see anything in this country. There's a lot of funding, infrastructure in parts of this country where the money's come from Europe, and we just don't tell anybody. You go to Ireland, you go to Germany, you will see a sign saying, road built with European funding. We have things in this country which Europe has directly contributed huge sums of money to. We just don't tell anybody. Surprise, surprise, everyone hears the negative stuff from the right-wing media, and they all think Europe's terrible. So in a referendum, we would have to have a balanced debate, and I'm hopeful and confident that, on balance, people will think, do you know what? Actually, we need to change Europe. We need to make it work better for us, but actually we're better off in than we are out.
Brilliant. Let's take some more questions from the floor. David, up. And then, can we keep questions and answers as concise as possible?
That was a ticking off for me, wasn't it?
Yep.
Earlier you mentioned how difficult it is for young people to get together a deposit for a house. And just following the budget with announcements about Help to Buy, I wondered what your thoughts and the Liberal Democrats' thoughts are on the Help to Buy policy.
I mean, obviously, we're in the coalition government, so that's something that would have been discussed within our party. So, I mean, that idea fundamentally came from within the Conservatives. We support it. We have our own very clear policy, which is that we think is a better and fairer way to enable people to buy their own property, which is rent to own, and I'll tell you why there's a difference between there. The Conservatives' policies for addressing the difficulty to buy housing seem to just be much more likely to fuel the price rises which are already happening. Whereas people are already renting in this country. So you're already spending that money every week, every month on renting a home. It's just that when you leave, you've got nothing for that. So our proposal is for a very different system whereby you'll be doing nothing different than you're currently doing, paying rent, but a proportion of that rent will go towards helping you buy that home and helping you effectively build up a deposit for that. So it's helping the demand side rather than overly fueling the supply side. But again, I go back to what I mentioned earlier on. Until we start building enough houses in this country, we will not solve anything to do with housing, and it doesn't matter how many elaborate schemes we come up with, we will always have this problem. We have to get Britain building. We've got a whole raft of policies to do that, from things like using planning permission or losing it within a short period of time, through ensuring the huge swathes of public sector land. As I mentioned, the examples in Bath, the Ministry of Defence land becomes available, to enabling people to self-build their own homes. There's lots of examples of how we would do that, but we've got to get building, and then we can look at the Help to Buys and the rent to own and things like that. But at the moment, there's a danger it'll just fuel the demand and not address the supply.
Okay, and to you,
Well, elephant in the room, tuition fees. I don't want to play the blame game because I don't believe it helps. But if we're going to send you into government again, what have you learnt about making promises that you can't keep? Because that's what I think the problem was.
Yeah. If Freddie will ingratiate me with a little bit of a longer answer in this one, because I think it deserves a decent response. I'll be done by Saturday, probably. Yeah, I mean, firstly, tuition fees was a torrid time for our party. I mean, that would be ridiculous for me to stand here and say it wasn't. I think there was a degree of making a pledge that we knew was very, very popular and we thought would be electorally successful and that we thought we would probably never be put on the spot to have to fulfill. I would urge anybody who's thinking of voting for the Green Party because of their policy on tuition fees to heed the lesson from that. It's very easy to promise the earth when you don't really expect to ever have to be in a position to deliver it. So the main thing, two things the Liberal Democrats have learned. Firstly, you will never see a Liberal Democrat signing a pledge to do anything. Not even that they'll go to sleep at the end of the night and wake up in the morning. They just won't do it because it's just you know it's really difficult. We got a kicking on that issue and probably rightly so. Secondly, we've learnt that our manifestos have been costed in the past, but we did a manifesto saying what we would do if there was an entirely Liberal Democrat government, and if there was an entirely Liberal Democrat government, we would have delivered on our promise on tuition fees. And the reason why is, I don't know if you've ever thought why Scotland doesn't have tuition fees, but the simple answer is it's because of the Lib Dems. The first government elected in Scotland after devolution was Labour and Liberal Democrats. And we managed to, and a year earlier, the Labour Party had introduced tuition fees nationwide, and we managed to get the Labour Party in Scotland over a barrel and get them to agree with our policy on tuition fees. And that was 1999. So we showed back then that when we could deliver on tuition fees, we absolutely would. The problem is, 11 years later, in 2010, we just couldn't deliver. The Conservatives had zero interest in it. So we need to make sure that our manifesto is written with an eye on the fact that we may not get everything we want in there. But also, to be honest with you, the public are going to have to get used to the idea of coalitions and that you do not get everything you want in a coalition. There's just no way around that. So, we delivered 80% of our manifesto, but people only remember that one big policy within the 20% that we didn't deliver. As an aside, when we didn't get our way with the Conservatives on tuition fees, the second part of the pledge on tuition fees was that we would ensure it was a fairer system, and I really do believe we've delivered on that. The Conservatives wanted to have no cap on tuition fees, which, trust me, in a university like the University of Bath, means you would be paying a lot more than £9,000 a year. This university would probably have gone for £15,000, £20,000 fees a year and market it mostly at overseas students because it's got the profile and the reputation to do that. We made sure there was a cap in there. We made sure that any college that charged at the cap level of 9,000 had to put significant sums into bursaries and scholarships to ensure access was good for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And we also made sure that the amount that got paid back every month was lower than it was even under Labour scheme previously. And we made sure that the level at which you had to start paying it back, £21,000, was higher, etc., etc. What you now see is actually a fairer system because there are now more people than ever before in this country going to university. There are more people from disadvantaged backgrounds in this country going to university than ever before, including going to the Russell Group universities. There are more people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds now going to university than ever before in this country. So on all those measures, it's clearly, in terms of social mobility and access, it is clearly a fairer system. It was a very difficult time for us within that. We have learned a lesson about what you put in your manifesto. And I think with everybody expecting another coalition next time, I don't think we'll have any banana skins like that in there again.
Thank you. Let's take a question from the lady at the top and then the gentleman at the bottom. The questions and the answers as concise as possible right now.
Hiya. You've said a few times that you've managed to enact 80% of your own manifestos in the coalition. Yeah. Now, I'm not actually clear what any of those are. So can you give me 3 quick examples of things that are wholly Lib Dem policies that you've managed to enact successfully in this government?
Yeah. There's a whole lot I could do. I'll just scribble down 3. Firstly, this isn't the sob story, this isn't the little violin, but I think part of the reason why you don't know what we've delivered is most of the press in this country is right-wing. We know that. The Telegraph, the Mail, the Hate Mail, the Daily Express, papers like that. Some is left-leaning, the Daily Mirror, the Guardian. The Independent are in the middle, and being independent, they don't really support anybody. So to cut long story short, the right-wing media hates the Lib Dems because they see us as stopping the Conservatives doing what they would like to see the Conservatives doing. The left-wing media hates the Lib Dems because they see us helping the Conservatives do what they want to do, and we have nobody in the media who supports us. So hence, Nick Clegg has been utterly vilified, and I think it's been really unfair how he personally has been treated. You make up your own view, but that's entirely an image that's been given to you by the media. And secondly, we're not getting our messages out in the national media, and that's why we have to rely on the local paper we put through doors and everything else to tell you what we're doing. In terms of 3 really positive things which we've delivered, and I'm so proud of these. The first one, we said before the last election, we would take the lowest paid people in this country entirely out of taxation. And I'll explain why that's so important. At the moment, minimum wage is roughly £12,500 a year. Under Labour, up to 2010, you started paying income tax at £4,500 a year. So once you earned a third of minimum wage, the government started taking money off you. And what did the government do with that money? Most of it gave straight back to you in various forms of benefits, working tax credits, everything else. There's no dignity in that. And on top of that, it created a ridiculous bureaucracy. Really, what was the point in that? We said we would take the lowest paid out of taxation. We said we'd lift the threshold at which you started paying income tax to £10,000. It was in the cover of our manifesto. Not only have we delivered that, we've now beaten that. As of the last budget, you now don't pay any income tax until you pay £10,500. So we've beaten what we said we would do, and we're now very clear. We want to raise that to £12,500. Now, in the 2010 leader debates, on video, David Cameron said the country could not afford to give the lowest paid that tax cut. In the coalition, we pushed it through, and surprise, surprise, you will hear the Conservative candidate and every other Tory saying, aren't we wonderful, we've taken the lowest paid out of tax. No, they only did it because of the Liberal Democrats in government, anchoring the government in the centre ground and working hard to make things fairer. 2 other quick examples. Pupil premium, really proud of this as well. We've had for too long a gap in attainment levels in education between the poorest and the richest children in our society. And there's a wealth of evidence that by the age of 7, if you're behind on reading and arithmetic, you will probably never catch up. So, and we really believe that early years education is absolutely key to social mobility. So we brought in, it was in our manifesto, we've delivered it in government, the pupil premium. And it's a pot of money which goes to schools, depending on the number of kids they have from disadvantaged backgrounds, and it's to ensure they get extra support personalised to them. And it was introduced 3 years ago, and the first evidence is coming through now. We're starting to see the attainment level between the wealthier and the poorer children in our schools narrow. So that's working, it's absolutely fantastic. And then finally, off the top of my head, it's one which probably isn't of great interest to you guys, pensions. Well, it is of interest to you. Anybody who either is retired or plans to retire at some stage will earn a pension. So hopefully all of you will get that far and you'll get a pension. Under the Labour government, in the last year of Labour, the state pension, which everybody gets, went up by 75p in 1 year. So basically, the state pension, which some people, that's all they have to live on when they're old, was effectively going down in real terms because the cost of living was going up. We've stopped that. It was led by the pension minister, Steve Webb, who was a lecturer in 3 East in this university up until 1997. And he's brought in what's called the triple lock. And that means pensions in this country will go up by at least, whichever is the highest, of 2.5%, or the average increase in wages, or the average increase in the cost of living. And over time, so for example, pensions have gone up 2.5% this year. The cost of living has only been about 1.2%. So over time, we will get pensions back to the situation they were in decades ago, where people can afford to have some basic living on the state pension, because at the moment, you can't live in it. So there's 3 really good examples, all on our manifesto. To be honest, there's lots more. Sadly, we just don't get the media telling people what we do in government.
Okay,
yeah, hi. Talking about the coalition, I'd be quite interested to know your personal view, not the party view, on going into coalition again with the Conservatives, potentially with the SNP. Would you prefer like a minority arrangement? And also, would you consider highlighting ahead of the election which of your policies you would negotiate on and which you would call a red line to avoid a situation in 2010 where you announce a flagship policy like scrapping tuition fees, which you can't deliver on?
Okay, good question actually. Firstly, I mean, it would be really presumptuous to sit and sort of play kind of fantasy politics. If we were kingmaker, we would do this and do that. Nobody has any idea whatsoever for how the dice are going to fall in this election, the number of seats. So I think I met with somebody from Sky News about 3 weeks ago, and he explained that they started to do scenario planning so they could have some idea ahead of election night, take something off the shelf that they've already started planning. He said they got to about 12 different possible governments, and they just gave up, and they just said, this is just pointless. Let's just see what happens. So firstly, we really don't know. I mean, personally, I'll be a bit honest with you. I would have some reservations about the prospect of going into coalition with the Conservatives again, if only that I would be a little bit worried about what it might do to our identity, because I don't think in this country we're completely on top of how coalitions work. If it was Germany, if it was France or Ireland, where they've had coalitions for years, people tend to get that a bit better. But I think we're still not really used to coalition in this country. There's another school of thought that says if we went into coalition with Labour, we might manage to piss off the other half of the country that we didn't piss off when we went into coalition with the Conservatives. So we could end up with 0% in the polls, but who knows? So I mean, to be honest, it's really difficult. It'll be one hell of a discussion by the party. We've changed our processes, actually, for how we do coalitions. The last one was basically negotiated really quickly over a weekend, partly because there was expected to be a big run on the stock market by the Monday if a government wasn't formed, a stable government. This time, I hope and expect we will take a lot more time to reach a coalition. Not quite as long as Belgium. I think they took a year to get around to it. We'll be a bit quicker than that. But if we're in an opportunity, we've got much clearer processes for who will be involved in that. I hope it'll take longer. We wouldn't rule anything out. We wouldn't rule anything in. I suspect we wouldn't be in a coalition with UKIP because that really wouldn't work. And then finally, the question around what would we negotiate on. To be honest with you, again, it would be sort of presumptuous for us to say that. And secondly, we just wouldn't reveal our hands. You're not going to tell people what your negotiation position is before you end up in a negotiation. So, I'm sure there's some things in there which are red lines for the party. I'm sure there's things in there that we give and take because you don't get everything coalition. But we certainly wouldn't tell people because otherwise they'd have us over a barrel in that discussion. Okay.
Brilliant. Let's say question from the gentleman up there and then one.
You mentioned party funding and kind of trying to change that earlier, and you specifically mentioned the Greens. Don't you think that's slightly ironic given the Lord Strasburger situation, and particularly that he has close links to Bath and mentions giving money to Bath and the Bath constituency in the video. So, like, do you feel that that you're just as guilty as that of the parties, and will that harm your chances in the election?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you probably have better things to do on a Monday night than watch Channel 4 dispatches. If you didn't see it, it was basically an extremely sophisticated media sting on all three political parties, where a wealthy business person with very solid business credentials was paid by dispatches to go and offer money to the parties and try to do it in a way that blurred the edge of who was given the money and therefore the law around it. So there was a suggestion as part of that programme, and all the three main parties basically were all shown on it, that a donation was taken by the Liberal Democrats which shouldn't have been taken. The individual who was involved in negotiating that has stood down from the Liberal Democrats' whip within the peer. It's gone into the Electoral Commission for investigation. We just need to see what comes out from that. So I won't comment on that specifically. But on the broader issue, and the bottom line is we have an arms race on political funding in this country. You have by far the wealthiest, the Conservatives. You've probably seen it in this city. If you live in town, there has been an absolute tsunami of literature coming out from the Conservative Party in this city. We have an MP and 24 councillors in this city. The Conservatives have no MP and 4 councillors, yet they have something like 2.5 times the staff we have. I mean, that's just absurd. And when you multiply it up at a national level, there's this arms race, which frankly is leading to grubby behaviour on all parties. And I didn't want to single out the Greens, apart from the fact that their candidate stood here a few weeks ago, so I'm told, and pretended that the Greens didn't play this game. Well, they have with Vivienne Westwood and her £300,000 donation. So until we do something to take big money, especially out of politics, we will continue to probably have this grubbiness, because everybody in politics wants to win, and you have to play catch-up with a very wealthy Conservative Party within that. A couple of other things I would mention. I mean, it's not just about money as well. I mean, you saw dispatches, so you're pretty well informed. I don't know if you saw in the Independent newspaper a couple of weeks ago, there was an article about the Conservative candidate in Bath, and the article basically named him as somebody who had done a deal with a pro-fox hunting group, whereby he had effectively sold his vote in advance of becoming an MP in return for them helping his campaign. Now, he's refused repeatedly in the local media to say if he did do a deal. All he said is they haven't knocked on any doors for him, but he hasn't said if they've given him any cash, if they've helped deliver any leaflets or anything else. So it's not just about money, it's about a lack of transparency. And that issue actually isn't just about fox hunting. In all honesty, has that candidate or any other candidate done any other deals that they're keeping secret from us? Well, you know, why do we have to wait and hear from the media? So we have this really grubby situation, and we either need to have, I would certainly say, caps on political donations. I think we should look at state funding of political parties, although I think that now is not the time to do that, because I don't think people would want public money going towards politicians to tell you how great they are. I don't think we could sell that to the people, but it's something we might have to look at some future point. But nobody is clean from this, and don't let UKIP or the Green Party or anybody else tell you that they're clean, because we have this situation where everybody's in a grubby arms race, and we need to do something to stop it.
Hi, what are your thoughts regarding means testing for the winter fuel allowance?
Good question. The NHS has said to all political parties at the end of last year that it needs another £8 billion in funding every year to be sustainable. And they said to every political party, what are you going to do about it? The Liberal Democrats are the only political party who has said it will provide that £8 billion, and we've provided a fully costed plan to do that. One of the areas in which we will help provide that £8 billion is by having an opt-in for winter fuel payments. At the moment, if you're Richard Branson, if you're a multimillionaire, and if the weather drops below a certain level for a certain period of time, ka-ching, a sum of money appears in your bank account, and you can't actually stop it. I mean, it's crazy. It goes to everybody who's old, whether you need it or not. If you means test it, it's really expensive just to do the means testing, and it probably wouldn't save any money. But if you have an opt-in, and I would only be in support of that if it was an easy opt-in, because bear in mind, a lot of old people don't use the internet, etc. But if you opted in, that way you could still get it if you really needed it. But to be honest, a lot of the wealthy people just aren't going to bother opting in for what are, for them, relatively small sums of money. So we would save some money, and that's part of how we meet our £8 billion commitment on the NHS. who have told political parties that's what they need. Just for perspective, no other party has said they'll provide the 8 billion. Labour have said they'll provide 2 billion. The Conservatives have said they'll provide an extra 2.5 billion. The Green Party have this, I have to make sure I get this right, have this notion that they will link funding to the NHS to the economy, which is slightly strange because if the economy takes a dip, that's usually the time when you have greater stress, depression, mental health issues. That's the last time you want funding for the NHS to be going down as well. So the NHS has made very clear it's in a funding problem. This is what we need. Will you provide it? The only party in the country said it will provide it is the Lib Dems. And by having an opt-in winter fuel payment, that's part of how we go to pay that.
Thank you. Let's do one more round of questions. So we have one from the gentleman there, and one from the
The world at large has largely said that the war on drugs has failed. In terms of the Lib Dems' reactionary policy, reformist policy, what would they do to tackle this issue, or is the timing still just not right?
I don't think you're up to speed with Lib Dem policy. It's reactionary is absolutely not what you could call it. Yeah, I mean, Nick Clegg, I'll give you a bit of background. In 1999, the Lib Dems came out and said we needed to look at whether it was wise to legalise marijuana, and all hell broke loose, mostly from that right-wing media, the hate mail and everybody else who I mentioned, and we were just beaten as a party, and it showed every other party that, don't mention drugs, things go horribly wrong. A couple of months ago, Nick Clegg, so bear in mind our leader and the Deputy Prime Minister, came out and openly said, the war on drugs isn't working, we need a more grown-up policy. The reason why he was able to say that is Norman Cook, not Norman Cook, that's the guy from, that's Fatboy Slim. Norman Baker, we haven't got him in the party yet, we're working on him. Norman Baker, who actually is a magician as well, was in the Home Office, and he, through a mixture of being sneaky and physically forcing a square peg in the round hole, got the Conservatives to agree to commission a study into drugs in this country, and the results that came back from that study were so categorical that the government, i.e. the Conservatives, could no longer hide and not ignore it. So that's what Nick Clegg then used to come out publicly and say, the war on drugs isn't working, we need a new approach. So the Liberal Democrat approach on drugs is, firstly, we will take drugs entirely out of the criminal law system and move it into the civil law system. So that effectively means that we will stop criminalising people for having, say, very small amount of drugs on them, because there's a huge waste in police time, in police costs and everything else. We need to be getting the big guys, the guys who are making huge sums out of drugs, who are effectively putting armed gangs on the streets to protect the drugs trade. 100,000 people have died in Mexico alone in the drugs war. We spent £1 trillion globally on this war on drugs since President Nixon started it, I think it was in '72. And what has happened? Nothing. At most, a tiny, tiny, minuscule change in drug use amongst young people, but that seems to be more just sort of an ebb and flowing kind of fashion and everything else. So it's not working. We want a different system. We've been very clear we want tests in the UK of the Portuguese system, where Portugal has decriminalised the possession of small amounts of drugs for personal use, and instead is ensuring that the resources go into dealing with people who are serious dealers, but also people who are serious addicts. So by taking it out of the criminal system, putting it into the civil system, we will focus on treatment for those who are the most serious, and also education, making sure that anybody who's involved in drugs will have to report for some education so they at least are told what the issues are. So we have, by far, the most grown-up approach of any major party when it comes to drugs. The Green Party will say they've got a very open approach on drugs, but frankly, they won't get anywhere near government to do anything about it. We're in government now, and we're fighting tooth and nail to get the Tories. The Tories still stand by the argument that the war on drugs is working, that prohibition is working, and it's completely counter-evidence and counterfactual. So we will keep pushing the fight for a more grown-up approach to drugs, because the current situation isn't working, and it's just creating vast profits for some really bad people, putting armed gangs on the street, and depriving the nation of tax revenues. In Colorado, as you probably know, where they changed their drug policy, the state has been creaming in tax. There's been no uptake in drug usage, no increase in drug usage, and they're able to monitor the system and ensure people with serious problems do get treatment. So we certainly don't have a reactionary policy on drugs. It's the most grown up of all the major parties, and we're the only party who's determined to do something about it.
Brilliant. And the last question up there, please.
Hi, yeah. Firstly, I find it a bit hypocritical how you accuse other parties of lacking transparency when you still haven't explained how you got our email addresses when you send it on unsolicited communications. But my actual question is, Don Foster's got a lot of personal support and a lot of personal appeal in Bath. A lot of the support for him is based on his personality. Do you think you're ever going to match that in your time if you ever got elected?
See, I'll start with that last. I'm damned if I do and damned if I don't. But anyway. No, so on the first one, I mean, I'm happy to be transparent on how we got those emails, but the risk is if it becomes public knowledge, you might find every pub and nightclub and everybody else in Bath doing the same thing. The university's door is open on People Finder to go in and find the email addresses of every single student and every single member of staff in this university. If you don't believe me, go home tonight and go into People Finder and fiddle around yourself. You will, within probably 30 seconds, work it out. That's as transparent as I'm prepared to be without really telling you. But I don't want you guys to be getting spammed by lots of other people because we shouldn't have done it. And if everybody else out there knows how to do it, they will do it as well. It's the first thing I would say. Secondly, I mean, Don's been fantastic for this city. He's been hugely popular. But we're very different people. One thing Don's been very good at is the personal sort of constituency one-on-one work, the pastoral care work. He's been fantastic at that. I'm learning a lot from him on that, so I sit in a lot of his surgeries, and he teaches me basically what you do when people come in, etc., etc., etc. So I would certainly look to keep those elements, but I'm very much my own person. I have very clear issues which are important to me in politics. Environment is absolutely one of them, where I'm very open in that I want to get into Parliament to be an unashamed, strong advocate on issues like climate change and environmentalism. That's an issue which Don's interested in, but it's not a burning passion for him, so I will be different on that. It's difficult. If I say to you, yes, I'll be better than Don Foster and everybody will love me, then I'll just sound like a bit of a dick, frankly. But I think I've got a shot at it. I kind of know how I get on with people. I did all right when I was president of Bath University Student Union. I was the first person to get re-elected. I kind of get on all right with most people. In many ways, I get on with people regardless of what class they're from. I think that's a real strength I have. I tend to get on with people from all backgrounds, which in a city like Bath, I think is pretty important. So, I really do hope I can fill Don's very big shoes. It's a tough ask. I just hope people in Bath will give me the chance to prove that I can be as popular, if not more popular, than somebody who's a really much-loved local MP.
Brilliant. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you, Steve, for answering all our questions. In 8 West 2.1, in 20 minutes, we will be airing the Cameron v Miliband's Showdown, Hustings thing that's on Channel 4. That's literally just next door. And on Saturday, the Ethical and Political Societies are doing a Bath and Beyond conference in East Building, which is starting at 11 o'clock and is running throughout the day. There are several external speakers talking about the international challenges we face and how we can solve them. Thank you again, Steve, for turning up. And
can I just very quickly say, if any of you are interested in getting involved in politics, finding out more about politics, this is a ridiculously interesting period of time. We're having a double election in Bath, as well as the general election. There's a local election on the same day. If you're interested in learning about how politics works, how campaigning works, we'd love to have you volunteer for the Lib Dems. Completely understand if that's not your thing, but the opportunity is there. You can either contact me tonight or at some other point. Just wanted to raise that.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you.